During the night of January 31st, many of the lower-lying districts of eastern England were overwhelmed by a devastating flood. A strong northwesterly gale had been blowing for some days, creating a tidal surge which swept down the coast to increase an already high spring tide. In some places, the total height of the water was more than 6 feet above the walls. Great gaps were scoured through the sea defences. People were awakened to find their houses surrounded in some cases by water many feet deep. It soon became apparent that this was no ordinary flood and that full-scale emergency measures were required. By daybreak, police, fire brigade and civil defence workers were fully mobilised. Boats were obtained from every possible source and used to rescue those who were trapped in their houses. To make absolutely certain that there were no people left in danger, a house-to-house search was organised in every district. The few stragglers who had previously refused to leave their houses were then brought to safety. Unfortunately, many people had no time to escape the rising waters. Some were drowned, some died of exposure in the bitterly cold wind. Ambulances worked continuously, and hospital wards were soon filled. The youngsters seemed to be able to look after themselves, and even appeared to enjoy it at times. Perhaps that was because the school was flooded. Some of the would-be rescuers found themselves in need of rescue when they underestimated the depth of the water. Above the flood level, small groups of people with their pathetically few belongings hastily snatched as they left home waited for transport to the evacuation centre. Emergency bus services from surrounding towns were soon in operation. Large schools were requisitioned, and the rest centre and emergency feeding services were provided with a realistic full-scale exercise reminiscent of wartime years. Collections of clothing and footwear were made to help those who had lost most of their belongings. Medical supplies were made available, and hospital services were set up. Babies and infants were given special care. And whole families were soon settled down in their new quarters. Meanwhile, in the school canteen, volunteer workers were busy preparing hot meals, and in a short time, thousands of people had been given food and shelter. But no matter how well they were cared for in the rest centre, it was natural to expect that the people's foremost thought was to get back home. It was necessary to keep a strict control over the movement of the people to and from the flooded areas. To prevent looting, all cars leaving the areas were carefully scrutinized and their drivers questioned. All people wishing to return home had to prove their identity. But even then, some were forbidden as their homes were unsafe. Those who were fortunate enough to get back had the heartbreaking task of clearing up the mess. Their return was made possible only by the tremendous efforts of members of the armed forces and civilian volunteers. Right from the start, men had been brought in from far and near. Engineers and surveyors of the river boards were quickly on the scene to examine the damage and prepare a plan of action. When the tide had gone out, it was possible to seal off the major breaches, but it was necessary to work both day and night under appalling weather conditions. Millions of sandbags were filled and used to stem the rush of water. The inaccessible nature of the sites prevented any extensive use of machinery, and manual labor alone had to accomplish the reconstruction. Even though the waters have now returned to the sea, much still remains to be done, and many months of work are needed to ensure that a similar catastrophe shall not occur again.